Okay, good evening. It's really, every year it's become more enjoyable. It's really incredible how we get this momentum and the projects are improving. It's really a pleasure. Okay, I'm really pleased to have Richard Sandor here as a MDP special speaker, and we're really fortunate to have him. I really met Richard Sandor in 1997. We had a White House task force that was supposed to sell Congress on the Kyoto Protocol and climate change policy. We got actually $5 million. We have about 20 people. And we tried to convince senators that voting for the Kyoto Protocol was in American interest. And as like now, people have this approach of America first, and no one really cared about climate change very much. I think the only senator that really cared was Senator Lugar. And what we try to do, we try to bring all the big academics, the Nordhauses and Stevens to speak and present why it makes sense to solve Kyoto, and either they didn't have a solid argument and didn't know anything about it. Till I remember one afternoon we were in the Phoenix Park Hotel, and the speaker was Richard Sandor. And he basically started speaking about what does it mean to have carbon trading. And he didn't speak like sometimes I speak with graph demand and supply. And he basically said how you design a market. How you design a market for carbon sequestration, how you design a market for forest product, how you take all these abstract elements that are unmeasurable and you commodify it, how you convince people to buy, how you convince people to sell, how you develop insurance. Now, the audience were staffers, Congress staffers, and 2 or 3 congressmen, and even Senator Roberts. And they were very cynical in the beginning, and at the end, they basically were convinced that you can use market forces to solve problems like climate change. And that was, in my view, was really big, because later on, the U.S. Suggested to use carbon sequestration as part of Kyoto, and they had a delegation that went to Bonn. The Europeans didn't buy it, but it really started a momentum toward the carbon market. Now, Richard started something that was called the climate exchange. That was a mechanism to try to trade in carbon. It wasn't a big success, but it was inspirational. And I really believe that when people started AB 32 in California and then the carbon exchange in Europe, his work was instrumental. He later on he receives a Legion of Honor in France, and I think it's because of work on carbon market. And later on, he really started to develop a lot of books, a lot of lectures, and have a lot of people working for him that they really knew how to introduce markets to solve environmental problems and to make the notion of payment for ecosystem services reasonable. Richard is a world-class financial innovator. He envisioned many trading in many future markets and options, and many people ask me, why does it matter? It matters a lot, because one thing I learned when I taught technology adoption, and that's what I taught for years, is that the main reason that people don't adopt technology is they don't have credit. And building mechanisms that provide credit is really crucial, and I think that a lot of the innovation that Richard developed are practical and used and have a lot of influence, and now we try to improve the way that we manage interest rate between banks, and that's something that I wish will be successful. Now, innovative finance is very important in sustainable development. When I envisioned started the MDP, my basic approach is to make it an MBA in sustainability. I really think that the key in development is not to be a school of social welfare, like most people in development are, but to try to make a change and to change the world and to really to develop people that are innovators, entrepreneurs, and make people around them that are enabler to people in developing countries or wherever they are. And I really think that's the spirit of the MDP, and I'm really, really happy that we have a person that is leading on finance that will really tell us, provide us in vision, and I think that finance is becoming and will become even further a very important part of the MDP. Richard, the floor is yours.
David, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. Being here tonight is personally very meaningful for me. I joined the faculty of UC Berkeley in 1966. I'm 700 years old. And I'm particularly mindful, as George was kind enough to pick me up, we drove by People's Park, where my wife and I celebrated her birthday on April 22nd, 1970, the birth of Earth Day. This university enabled me. My kids were born in Alta Bates Hospital. My wife was the founding treasurer of NOW in Berkeley. We had a time of change, and everything was possible. And some of the ideas that I had that turned out to be reasonably commercially valuable, David, were born here on the campus. Interest rate futures, catastrophe bonds, environmental products, and in fact, the early work on electronic trading and the blockchain. So virtually every dream I've had, this campus gave to me. So it's a very special and emotional moment for me to be here with you. This is a place and an environment where one can dream and fulfill those dreams. And I want to share with you tonight a little bit about perceptions and realities, you know, the things that we think are real and the things that are actually facts. And in fact, it's a really important lesson for environmental movements and sustainable growth. So let's take a look at perception. In 07 and 08, Fannie Mae, which owns all of the mortgages in the United States, and Freddie Mac and Snoopy existed in 2007 and 8. What's the perception here? The perception is they're all dogs. What's the reality? One of them's a good business, Snoopy. The other two were federalized. So let's talk about perception and reality, about markets, environment, and things of that nature. Let me start with a simple example. All of this is predicated, all of these environmental, on creating a cap of emissions. And under that cap, you keep reducing it. So whether it's pollution into waterways, into the air, there is a limit which keeps on decreasing. If David Power and Richard Energy are subject to a cap, and David Power is very efficient, he can go below the cap. Richard Power or Richard Energy may not be as good because I can't install the technology, I don't have the acreage, but I can, in fact, be in compliance by buying David Power's reduction. That is called cap and trade. And it has been the subject of a talk that I gave at the White House in 1997, as David pointed out, and to some events. And in fact, they came into the concept early on when, in 1990, the United States Senate passed the Clean Air Act of 1990. And none of you will remember, or the most of you will not remember, that in the 1980s, acid rain was viewed as an apocalypse that was going to destroy the United States Northeast and Midwest. You get acid rain when you burn coal. You burn coal, sulfur is emitted along with carbon and mercury and NOx. That sulfur rises into the atmosphere, combines with oxygen, rain comes, and that's called acid rain. We were emitting at that time in the United States about 18 million tons. And Congress passed an act that said we're going to take that 18 million, knock it down to 9, knock it down to 4.5 million tons. It was viewed with incredible skepticism, and I am making this analogy because you hear this about climate change and global warming. Number one, any country that adopted this would result in being uncompetitive internationally. The price of power would rise, retailers would suffer, and exporters would be harmed. The result of that program was to take the 18 million by 2000 down to 9 million and then down to 4 million where it is today. The cost of that program, which people said would bankrupt all of the power sector, was 3 to 4 billion. And if you look on the EPA website, the benefits associated with reduced health care costs for that program, health care only, annually, is $147 billion. I do believe in this program. Cost benefit is studied, and I know personally of nothing that ever compares with a cost-benefit ratio of that magnitude. That program was an unambiguous success, and so we went around, as David's saying, starting in Rio in the Earth Summit, to say, look, we took part of that because some folks said you had commoditized interest rates. Can you commoditize air? And I said, yes. And there's a way to do it mechanically, and there's market architecture. The perception in Europe, where it has a wide-scale cap and trade market throughout the European Union, it is known as the EU, European Union Emissions Trading System, ETS. That has been in operation in a pilot program in 2005. and full implementation in 2008. The perception again, is that it's a failure. It hasn't worked. And why hasn't it worked? Because if you go to 2017, 2018, you will see that prices of carbon hovered around $5. And if you Googled the European Union's cap and trade system, you will find hundreds and hundreds of articles about prices being too low, which is like a Philadelphia lawyer's question, when did you stop beating your wife? Okay? It is the wrong question. The goal is to reduce emissions, not to cause the price of carbon to be very high. Yet everybody focused on it being a disaster, it's terrible, etc. And in fact, the goals set were low, but they were subsequently changed. If you look at the reality, EU from the phase is down 20% in emissions. So talking about a $5 price is totally irrelevant in the efficacy of the program. Perception, like Snoopy, this thing is bad, but like Snoopy, it is a good business, and it has worked. And the European Union has changed as of 2019 reduction caps down 24% for 3 years, and then in 2021-22 down another 12%. That's the perception, that's the reality. What about the United States? What's the perception? Cap and trade, it was defeated with McCain-Lieberman. It was defeated by Waxman-Markey. President Obama threw in the towel in 2010. And every other administration has failed to make any dents, and the current administration has loosened all of the environmental rules on coal. So the perception is markets are dead in the United States. That's not the reality. And let me share with you, you live in this great state. It has a cap and trade system. Environmental emissions have gone steadily down with little noticeable effect. So it's alive in California. It's alive in the Northeast, in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And in fact, states that withdrew, like New Jersey, are going to come back and join. It will be extended like into Virginia. In fact, David, in the Chicago Climate Exchange, Berkeley was a founding member, and as was Oakland, and a guy by the name of Jerry Brown was then mayor of Oakland. And so there is a receptiveness to it. What does it look like? How do these markets, and then there are renewable energy certificates, what you get for producing green power, renewables. They are in 30 states. They are widely traded. In, of all states, New Jersey and Massachusetts, where you think solar power, New Jersey, it doesn't compute. But yet, New Jersey is a leading state regarding renewable energy. So what's the reality? That's all fine. It's anecdotal evidence. California, RGGI, all kinds of laws, renewable energy, and in 30 states, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. How big is this? It's nice to say it, but what's the facts on the ground? If somebody were to guess how big it is, I want to define a term called open interest. Open interest is the breadth of a market. How many open contracts are there between people to buy and sell a commodity at some time in the future? And that's considered, along with volume, which is the daily volume, the most important measures of breadth. But open interest is the key. What is the reality of North American environmental markets compared to gold? Anybody? We think gold is very large. How does environmental markets in the United States compare? 10%, 5, 20? Anybody hazard a guess?
Are we measuring volume or open interest?
Open interest.
Well, I suppose you wouldn't pose the question unless the environment was much larger. Otherwise, it would be.
This is how nice it is to have a 40-year friend in the audience. It doesn't get any better than that. And in fact, there's environmental open interest in U.S. markets is 600,000 contracts. It's 15% bigger than gold. It's almost 8 times bigger than platinum.
Are you measuring that open interest globally or just in U.S. markets?
U.S. gold open interest.
There's gold open interest in London as well.
Yes, there are. But I'm trying to compartmentalize it to U.S. markets, U.S. gold, U.S. environmental markets. In fact, Gordon, you bring up a very good point. The environmental open interest in European carbon is in the millions. So you want to just make sure you don't compare apples and oranges, right? It would be unfair to put up 2 million international carbon versus U.S. gold. So this is apples and oranges, not. It's U.S. trading in gold, U.S. trading in silver, U.S. trading in platinum, and these numbers are the reality. The breadth of precious metals compared to renewable energy is below. It's not proof of anything, but it sure is different than most people. If you go to Washington and say, hey, do you understand what California carbon options and open interest is? They don't think it's of anything. We're on to perception and reality. One of the big questions is, what about China? The perception is, in fact, that it doesn't much matter what we do because China is so dominant in emissions. And just to give you a comparable, while the height of the U.S. market, we had 18 million tons. China has 36 million tons. It's the same size geographically and 4.5 times the population density. So, in fact, if you could cure acid rain, you probably have a drain annually in medical expenses, present valued, of not 147 billion, as I said about U.S. sulfur. It's probably $500 billion to $1 trillion would be the gain just from reducing it. And do not think there's nothing happening. Particulates are down 40% in the last 4 years. Command and control, just everybody lower it. There are blue skies in Beijing. So there's progress being made. Number 2, we started David, introducing cap and trade markets in China in 2006. We opened the first Chinese climate exchange, and the first trade was in SO2 allowances. There are now 7 of those in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, Hubei, etc. It doesn't look like they're doing anything. No progress is being made. In fact, the movement in political power is evidenced by the fact that the NDRC, which is the state planning agency, had control of pilot market programs, and a week ago they moved it into the EPAs, just like we do with sulfur. Everybody who typically reads headlines viewed this as very bearish. We sat with the negotiators from China in Kyoto and said, look, you've got to put it into the EPA when you implement. So they are now going to assign the credits in mid-July is the chatter, and probably in 2021 you will see the beginning of trading. And if we think about the timeline from the European Union and the intellectual introduction of any financial innovation, it's 15, 20 years, and they're no different than it is with any other environmental movement. It takes 15 to 20 years. It takes it for power steering, invented in the 30s, implemented in the 50s, the PC invented in 75, the web in 95. So they're right on target with industrial and financial innovation. In fact, they stand to be the biggest market of all. Let me move on, if I can, to talk about the reality of cap and trade in the world. In our lens, it's dead, right? We just illustrated it wasn't dead. So let's take a look at it worldwide. There's an active and viable market in the EU ETS. There's a pilot market in Brazil and even in Mexico. There is one going in Australia, and China and India have renewable energy markets, etc. California, the blue dot in the United States, is alive and well. Reggie is alive and well, and the other thing. There's a corollary here, notice, for the quantitative students in the audience, that the success of carbon markets is directly proportional to the distance from Washington, D.C. This is a very important fact, okay? And it stands up quantitatively, George. You know, you can show that it exists. So in fact, you know, don't read the press. It's not dead. It's alive and well here in California, in the Northeast. It's being studied in India. It'll probably be implemented in China in a broad market scale. Let me now turn to another issue, water. I believe that this will be the most important commodity of the 21st century. There's only really 3 continents that are long water. They are North America, South America, and Europe. The Middle East is short, India is short, China is short, and dramatically. And the western part of the United States is short water. And we're going to have to address that as a challenge. Food for thought. If you have a pound of chicken, you're consuming 470 gallons of water. If you have a hamburger, it's 634, and if you have a 1 pound steak, you are at close to 1,900 gallons of water. Not sustainable. The point is, and David, you will appreciate it, is that we already trade water. We don't call it water trading. We call it grain trading. Grain trading, if you measure and take a look at the water content, the U.S. exports water. We do it through grain. It's a very inefficient way to trade water. And as a University of Chicago faculty member, transactions costs, the transparency, etc., are all very, very critical. This is a challenge. I want to speak now a little bit about, for the last 5 minutes that I have allocated to me, if I try to stick on time, George, and then we'll open it up for questions, to talk about another major change that's going on, and that is, I believe, a worldwide change as important as the web and the internet, and that's blockchain and the technology underlying it. And I want to start out by telling you it's not a thing of tomorrow, it's a thing of today. And I want to frame it in terms of a timeline. And the timeline, if we look at financial innovation and the examples I gave you, an industrial, a 10, 20-year cycle, when did the blockchain begin in Bitcoin? Anybody know? 2010. 2009, right? Nakamoto came up with cryptocurrencies. Everybody thinks the perception he did it. Wrong. The reality is a Princeton professor in 1990, Stuart Haber, and a partner developed the blockchain. And they actually applied it in 1994, and the trusted third party was an ad every Sunday in the New York Times for the transparency. So if we do the same mathematics, 1990, we're here, okay? 2020 to 2021, this is going to be ubiquitous. It is going to be explosive. Why is that important for sustainable development and your program? Almost every example that I saw out there, the blockchain would be useful for: the pumpkins, the drought insurance, the issues of even women, and looking down the notes I took, all of them, drought insurance. There's catastrophe bonds traded in the Caribbean against hurricanes on the blockchain. It's already going on. It's cheap, it's efficient, and you can do it through Ethereum and smart contracts and lots of market architecture. David's vision is right. If you are to go out there, please take a look at it, because it's not a thing of tomorrow. It's already existing with Exxon and Shell and BP, with an energy trading platform that exists. ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange, who brought the Chicago Climate Exchange from us in 2010, is shortly to start a Bitcoin, and their partners are Starbucks. The exchange that I was part of the development team for, the first climate exchange in China, when we sold it to the New York Stock Exchange in 2010. And importantly our investors made 7.5 to 15 times their money on it. And it is important because I walked out there about sustainable development, and rates of return on equity important. They drive capital into the sector, and they'll do it in sustainability like they do everything else. So there's also already energy trading. There is a commodity platform called Comgo. I think I was talking to or talked about not only the pumpkins, but a program in Ghana, which I took a look at, and I thought it was only cocoa. It's all these crops. The whole notion of the blockchain, and let me back up for 30 seconds. The blockchain is only an accounting ledger. It's a debit and a credit that can't be hacked. So it's a set of books that can't be hacked. And there's a coin associated with it, which is called a cryptocurrency. All of the emphasis is on the cryptocurrency and the price of it, as opposed to the underlying technology. So that's a food for thought. And Lithuania has a power grid. Rocky Mountain Institute has just set up an organization with the backing of significant financial institutions in Europe to develop a complete tracking of energy at sources so that you can buy where it came from, buy whether it's wind or solar. This enormous grid that you and the consumer in your kitchen can also basically, if you have storage, buy into solar power, store it, get a coin for it, sell it back into the grid. There's a revolution going on, and you are the next generation. Please watch it carefully. It is like the web, and it is going on and will create enormous value in sustainability. Small solar projects, trading of it in Africa and countries that don't have it. It will do what the iPhone did, and not requiring landlines and things of that nature. So this blockchain and specialized cryptocurrencies have a value in a closed network. Let me conclude, and there's lots more that I could say, and talk about one potential application. In the Chicago Climate Exchange, which David mentioned at the outset, we had a voluntary program. It was a program that was 108 pollutants. Every Ford, Honeywell, IBM, DuPont all signed a commercial contract, even though there was no federal law, to reduce emissions, and they did by more than they exceeded. We had a program that also recognized offsets. Offsets, as opposed to producing pollution through the generation of power, it stops pollution that would have occurred otherwise. And the idea of environmental markets is not to punish the polluter. It's to provide financial incentives not to pollute. Okay, that's a very important difference, because we often were at odds with environmental communities that didn't like the fact that polluters could make money by cutting pollution. And they got confused about what they do on Sunday in their churches and objectives of reducing emissions. There was a clear moral aspect of it and I sat in a room in Washington, David, at around the time, and they talked about punishing the polluter, and I said, I'm in the wrong place. I thought I was here to try to save my grandchildren and cut pollution. I wasn't in the moral hazard business or punishment game. In any event, I present this Kerala example because we got rural poor in India. They were given stoves, anaerobic microdigesters, in which you put cow manure in it, and you don't fill it up. It's really like a garbage can. The methane rises. You run a pipe from that anaerobic digester into the house. The result is you can cook. The alternative would be to burn wood inside the house to achieve the same goal. Since that methane didn't go into the air, and methane is 21 times more potent than carbon, this was avoided emissions. And each family got about 4 to 5 tons of reduction of methane, of carbon equivalents. And they sold it for $20, $5 a ton. And we started with 3,000 rural poor in Kerala. And then we got up to 10,000 families, and then we got to 50,000, and then we got to 100,000. And we did this without the blockchain. We had no remote sensings. We had the people checking on each other. It was prohibitively expensive. Today, you could go like this, boom, remote sense it, record it on the blockchain, and give them payment the same day. And we got 150,000 rural poor to change their behavior, because $20 a family is a lot of money in the poorest place. This, the blockchain, carbon markets, tradability now become simpler, and all of the transactions costs of monitoring, of verifying, of payments, of wiring, etc., dramatically go down. And you could, I don't know what the factor is, but maybe do it and give them $40 a year. Let me conclude. What have I said? I said this is a world about perception and reality. Things don't always appear what they are. And it's particularly true in environmental markets. The European Union's trading is alive and well, and if you go back, prices have now started to rise. Everybody's happy, and we think things are going. Perception, it's dead in the U.S. The reality, it's not. California is leading the way. So is the Northeast with Reggie. So is renewable energy in states like Texas that one wouldn't think. Perception and reality, we said in China, it's the same thing. Perception, nothing happening. The reality is they could have a full-blown trading system in 3-4 years. Perception, markets aren't necessarily good. That's true in Washington, D.C., but in California it's not, and in China and in the Politburo it's not. They think markets are very fine in the People's Republic of China. Perception, what is this blockchain? It's a brand new thing. It'll never work. Orville, it'll never fly. It's actually 28 years old, and if it matches other adoption patterns, it's going to be ubiquitous, and there's enormous amount going on in energy and emissions in that area. And in the last part, all of these markets and the value can simply, unambiguously, categorically improve the lives of rural poor in the poorest province in India. This is your world. Embrace change. Look at markets as one vehicle and recognizing that there's a technological change. It's a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you.
Some volunteers, right? I think I have volunteers. Yes, why don't you go ahead?
I'm embarrassed to say that whenever I've heard of blockchains, my eyes glaze over, and I thought, that's something I don't have to worry about. So you've convinced me I'm wrong. Is there a book that's particularly good on this, for non-economists, but just to kind of move along the learning curve?
I happen to write one. I think it's somewhere around here. It's about, it measures this timeline stuff, and one of my co-authors is really smart. I'm not, and he's a guy by the name of Don Tapscott, and he wrote the bestseller New York Times called Blockchain. If you want an overview of the birth of electronic trading, which occurred right here in 1970, if you take a look at the statement of the CFTC chairman about the adoption, he ratifies that from a regulatory point of view, this will go. So I will suggest that you look at Don Tapscott. Tapscott also wrote a chapter in my book. Some of you it may have sentimental because I talk about Berkeley in the 60s and what it was like on Sproul Plaza and People's Park, and my wife getting tear gas with the kids from the Alameda County Police. So it's a little walk down memory lane.
Well, I was here in the 60s as well, so we can...
you can remember.
I'll read it with interest.
Okay.
If, in fact, coming back to that slide you had up there, Richard, a moment ago, if, in fact, you wrote that white paper in 1970, how come that isn't the prior art for the Wagner patent? Why was the Wagner patent approved?
There's a very interesting story here, and I'll just give you a teaser for the book. I wrote the paper. I took a semester off. I wrote it in '69. I submitted it. And everybody, this was before personal computers, and it talked about cathode ray tubes and modems. It was Berkeley really being berserkly in the 60s. So you can imagine the reception I get around the world when I said someday there's going to be electronic trading, and as a professor in Berkeley who's just done a feasibility study on it. And there was an article in the New York Times. What happened was it all went away in '84. A woman from the CFTC came up with a patent, and then the Swiss started in '86. It was adopted by the Germans in '90. In 2000, a guy by the name of Howard Lutnick from Cantor Fitzgerald bought the patent. My wife, who was here in those days, said, "Didn't you do something 21 years? Because he's charging all of these exchanges $20 million for the license to the patent." And so I called up IBER and here at Berkeley, and I said, this thing, I wrote this study, I submitted it, no record, it's missing. Okay, so there was no record here in California of it going on. I called up the Pacific Commodities Exchange, and most of those people are, God bless them, are no longer here on the planet, and the ones that were, I had a partner in electrical engineering and computer science. He didn't have a copy of it. I called a lawyer. They didn't have a copy of it. My wife says, how could it have gone missing? And why did this woman, get the patent? Because in the book you'll see the schematics for the diagram for the trading are virtually identical. There were some people I know who started a Bermuda.
Maybe it didn't go missing. Maybe Wagner got it.
Well, there is a plausible case to be made that one of the people who funded the study started an exchange in Bermuda, and he may have had the study, and Susan Wagner may have watched it in the thing. Anyway, the bottom line is I send down a research assistant to go through all my papers, and it falls out of a box. I call, and 2 exchanges already had bought the patent. I called the third one, the NYMEX, and they loved it. They brought the to the judge as prior art. Judge agreed, but the submission was a week too late. And so then I gave it away to my European friends at the London Exchange. And then subsequently, I tried to convince the patent lawyers here, why don't you take it, because I don't, we should at least be 50-50 partners. And the patent lawyers didn't want to, accept the transfer of IP over to the university, so that's where it ended.
My simple hypothesis, the reason they paid for the Wagner patent is because all of them were about to go public. And as a result, they didn't want any litigation risk setting a barrier for them to go public.
You're exactly right. It's a hypothesis is valid because I was there and I went to them and nobody said, we're going to create a multi-billion-dollar public offering. We don't want a lawsuit about IP because it'll delay the IPO forever. Anyway, it's a curious story, but it's a curious story about Berkeley and what the intellectual environment was like at that point. There wasn't anything that you couldn't throw up in the air. Financial futures, who heard of that? How could you have futures on interest rates? That it would only come out of Berkeley in the 60s. Electronic trading, that's Berkeley in the 60s. You could never buy and sell stocks with a machine, so this is a home for intellectual stimulation.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Thank you for speaking tonight. I'm pretty excited about it. I'm a former MDP, and I work on climate and energy issues and have since before the days of Waxman Markey. So super excited to hear about it. We learned all about cap and trade through the acid rain program back then. So it's been really fascinating listening to you tonight. Thank you for coming. What I wanted to ask about is sort of the future of cap and trade versus carbon tax. So Washington State just failed to pass a carbon tax initiative this week on the ballot for their election. Here in California, our cap and trade program has been successful. We have been consistently reducing our emissions from the electricity sector, but our transportation sector emissions continue to grow. And our cap and trade program is not economy-wide. It's a lot easier to regulate emissions from large sectors like the power sector, but we can't really regulate our individual decisions as a consumer for transportation in the same way. So I'm wondering what you think about the future of cap and trade, understanding this challenge. Like California's been doing well on the cap and trade front. We've been doing well on reducing our emissions, but we're 1% of global emissions. And the IPCC recently told us we're all screwed, right? So what do we do that can reach beyond just the power sector from a market perspective? And do you think that a carbon tax will replace cap and trade in the next 5 to 10 years?
I am let me frame the thing in 2 ways, and let me put my bias. Obviously, I've been working in environmental markets for 30 years, okay? I am, by very nature, cynical of big bureaucracies and governments solving a lot of social problems. I don't think they've been effective. And I live in a state where we raised or doubled the income tax and the deficit went up. I think that I want to frame it, though, intellectually and put aside my personal proclivities. There are 3 things to do. One is called command and control, and you just legislate. Sometimes that's effective, like miles per gallon, right? So that's got to be in the mix. sometimes, in effect, a tax or a subsidy can help kickstart, and economists would tell you infant industry arguments that you have to get to scale, so you could argue subsidizing solarized panels are good, and taxes may deterrence. I come from a world in which and that's called a flexible mechanism. So there's command and control, then there are flexible mechanisms. Category A in flexible mechanism is taxes. Category B is subsidies, and then there are markets. My friend and mentor, a man by the name of Ronald Coase, wrote an article in 1960 called The Theory of the Social Cost, where he eventually won a Nobel Prize, in which he argued that contracting between two individuals, and particularly the externality case of a train going through an agricultural field and sparks flying off, could, instead of prohibiting the train or taxing the train, that there might be a more efficient solution. Okay? I have trouble with taxes because I think the price motivates. Taxes should translate like a cap and theoretically provide the same incentives. I don't think in reality they do, and I'll give you one anecdotal piece of evidence. And I was at the Chicago Climate Exchange. We put up the price of carbon, and I got a note from a professor at MIT, Isaac Berzin. And he said, I've got this idea. You take algae, you put it around a smokestack, and you create biofuels out of it. And he was a professor, and he said, I can reduce these algae, can suck in the carbon, and I saw the price was $4. I think I can do 300 million, and I think I can become a billionaire. I think if you post a tax that doesn't create the same incentives for innovation and for whatnot, it doesn't have the clarity. It's not saleable. And while under some circumstances it's the same, otherwise I think it's a dead end, because often there's arbitrage. I'd rather set the cap and let the price change, or the tax, because that's what it is, rather than set the tax and assume there's a one-to-one mapping that the tax will cover it, because there's nobody better in the United States than the American Society of CPAs. The day the tax reform comes out, the next day you get a call from your accountant about how to avoid it, and the abilities to arbitrage. But if you put an emissions monitoring on a smokestack and say it's got to go from this to this, that's much harder to arbitrage than a tax system. I said with Waxman-Markey, people said, what do you think? And I said, this is remarkable to me. It's 1,300 pages, and then there was a manager's amendment, which was another 400 pages. The climate bills were larger in words and pages than a combination of the New Testament, the Old Testament, and the Quran. Okay, now if you can't say cut your emissions by 20%, that's the same thing as 2,300 pages in the tax reform bill or any of these. The 2,300 was the tax reform, the banking legislation. Dodd-Frank was 23. The climate was thing. The bill comes out at 3 o'clock in a manager's amendment. For those of you who are not familiar, is everybody gets the bill going, and then the manager of the bill gets to negotiate with all the congressmen who didn't have it, and they come out with a manager's amendment. In the case of Waxman-Markey, it came out at 3 o'clock, And 435 congressmen voted 2 hours later. I had 6 guys trying to read it in Chicago and 3 women in New York. And we couldn't, with 9 people, figure out what the manager's amendment was. So I'm for simplicity. And this, in the acid rain program, the entire part that deals with trading is 17 pages. It says you get it, you got to reduce it, here's the timetable. You could write an 8-page bill. And look at nobody knows what's in this current latest tax bill. I mean, except, the people who wrote it. So I think the bottom line is, I think the markets are going to be very efficient. I think the thing that will come out, the irony of the situation is I got more reception from the People's Republic of China and the government Chinese officials for cap and trade than I did in Washington. Don't underestimate the Chinese, okay? And don't underestimate their belief in capitalism. And don't underestimate how they must be smiling when they implement a system and we're having 2,000-page bills that deal with command and control and taxes of this and taxes of that. The summation is, it's a long-winded answer, is I think the success of California and the changes that will come from monitoring and censoring and electric cars and things like that, I'm really bullish on it because the state is incredibly innovative and it's a source of technology. And somebody's going to come up with a way to monitor all these small entities. I did it with our company only had 108. It costs us nothing to monitor, but the granular you get, the better off you are. And I think we're in the technology change in the blockchain that we're going to do it. Having said that, I think there's room for command and control. There's room for taxes, but I wouldn't make them the primary tool. I would make cap and trade the primary and use command and control in cases like miles per gallon, some subsidies for like solar panels, things like that, some taxes, but I'd take regulated, transparent markets that price the externality as the preferred solution.
Okay, we have a few more questions.
So the fundamental problem that I see with the idea of the blockchain for these physical systems is that it's this trustless, unhackable ledger. But when you're inputting physical data into this, you have to trust the source. The source can just input bad data and then it is there. This is the billion-dollar question. How do you solve that kind of issue?
It is the absolute right question and the thing. If you think of the blockchain as a pipe, you can't break the pipe. But when you put water in this end and it comes out the end, the hackable part about it is this, Japanese exchange that went down, all of that stuff that went down is the ends. And so I think that the input of that will be designed and controlled by Ethereum, smart contracts, not the open source public blockchain. But I think we're going to be surprised how many Ethereum-based, there'll be millions of these. I think there's 2,000 cryptocurrencies now, 1,500 exchanges. There's probably 1,000 corrupt ones. They're not regulated. They're not transparent. And you're dead on. And the only way to do it is to do it, with small numbers. As the young woman just asked about, how do you control all of these sources and how do you do that? It has to be a more finite model. There is always a danger at the beginning and end you're going to have a corrupt input or a corrupt output. So it's a very smart observation.
Yes, thank you very much. You're making me feel slightly better about my modest investment in cryptocurrency, which is looking bad now. But speaking of the blockchain, I have two questions. You can answer either one. What about the environmental externalities of running blockchain on all these systems? As I understand, it's very energy intensive. The other question is, do you think that the international finance organizations have the ability to stymie cryptocurrencies?
No, this is really you again have very smart questions. What? No, these questions are all on the mark, and I'm saying it. You're asking the exact question, and I'm appearing on a panel on the University of Chicago on Saturday. The moderator is a guy by the name of Lars Peter Hansen, and he's a renowned Nobel Prize-winning economist, and we're asking the very same questions that you're asking. The Riksbank in Sweden now is talking about it. You know, I'm going to mention there are people talking about central banks to use, instead of gold, a basket of currencies, of commodities. That couldn't have been done without the blockchain efficiently. You can't put oil and gold and physical, but with the blockchain you can do it. This is a huge challenge for the banks and the central banks and the regulators, because while Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies aren't yet accepted as a commercial medium, they're not a unit of a store of value. They're not a medium of exchange yet. You know, the three things that economists generally define money, they are not. Alternatively, you wonder, and just think about this as an example. I was the chief when I left Berkeley, I took a 1-year sabbatical to try to develop what was then financial futures and catastrophe bonds. And it was a sabbatical, and I thought I'd stay there for a year and whatnot. And then the Arab oil and everybody threw me. I got thrown out of the best banks in New York, and they said, go back to Berkeley. It's a stupid idea. Interest rates don't fluctuate. There's no need to hedge. And then 73 came, and the Arab oil embargo, and interest rates went to 10%, et cetera. I'm mentioning this because I don't know much about physical commodities. I traded them, you know, but I didn't know. But I was tasked with redesigning the soybean and wheat contracts in corn, which I did. And I just want to give you an example of something of what potential disruption about. The biggest commodity trading firm in the world is privately held. It's called Cargill. Okay, they dominate agriculture. It's based in Minnesota. And they originate grain, let's say, in Kansas. In a small farmer sells wheat. The wheat then goes from the small farmer to what is called a sub-terminal, a small country elevator. The country elevator then trucks it to a sub-terminal, maybe a larger elevator, which then goes to a terminal elevator. So it goes farmer, small, medium, large, grain terminal. Gets loaded out of the grain terminal onto a barge, gets floated down the Mississippi. Then it gets loaded into an export elevator because you got to load the ship. Then it goes onto the ship. Then it goes to Rotterdam. And then after Rotterdam, it gets out of the ship. It goes into the silo. It comes down and it's railed to Germany. Okay, and then gets milled and gets sold in the thing. Their margins for this business is 2%, which is what a credit card company gets for moving money from one account to the other. Is that sustainable? That's the question I'm asking all of you. If you're a great retailer, you bring 1 or 2% down to the bottom line. Payment systems, this whole banking world has got to be changed and is going to be changed. The role of the central bank of the future, we don't know. Part of it was driven by, the fact that it was, in a book I describe actually, a visit to a guy in Palo Alto, my first experience, who had Argentinian pesos, his family, and moved it into cryptos before, when they couldn't be exported. So it was used originally for legitimate subcurrencies. It was also used for illicit activities, right? Drug dealers hiding money, things like that, but literature was founded on porn, so, don't look at, don't look at the purpose and use of a social innovation because it gets transmorphed over the 20 years of commercialization. So your point is dead on. We don't know what's going to happen. It's hard to control. But I don't think you can control it. Gordon, to this point, the market's got involved. You're going to get some bad actors. They're going to get smacked in the head. It'll get regulated. It'll get transparent. I think by George's movement, it is time for me to say au revoir, George, if I read your body language correct.
No, it was just where you were going with the history of literature that I thought it was time for me to.
Wait, one question. One question.
All right, let's.
Wait, one question.
Thank you very much.
All right.
One question.
Go, MBD.
Thank you all very much.
One question. One more. Please, just one. You're going to love this one.
All right.
Okay. So my professor at Cal told me that, the assumption of all screw-ups, he didn't use that word, it was a little more profane, was assumptions. And the assumption with blockchain is that it's not hackable. But what happens when quantum computers come online? And can you build in back doors?
Yeah, I honestly, as a student of inventive activities, and a practitioner, I've spent my life trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I am a firm believer that too many of us look at the equation in a way that's going to lead us to a less than possible conclusion. Almost all of the work that we had when we developed the climate exchange was what was wrong with it? Leakage. It was voluntary. It would never fly. And I keep on saying to everybody who questions the what ifs that the idea of Orville and Wilbur Wright was to get the sucker to fly for 50 seconds. There were no seat belts. There were no emergency doors. And it was to get it. So if we are students of technological change, we don't ever know. All of this is a bold experiment, and I don't know what's going to happen with quantum computers. And your question is, again, smart and valid. But from inventive activity, you don't start with your first plane as a 747. You get a sucker up there built out of wood and paper, and you get it to fly, and you prove it can be done, right? And that's true, and Jobs didn't come up in 75 with an iPhone, right? It took till 2007 before you got that technology. The only thing I will say to you, in a passion, because you are the best and the brightest, never short humankind's ability to create and invent. It's a bad bet. Okay? It's just really a bad bet to short the ability of men and women to create and innovate. And not a good way to live your life, because you'll get pretty disappointed. You know, change is good. Embrace it. It's your friend. Look at it as an opportunity, and I think it will serve you well, and especially given the fields that you're doing. Congratulations, George David, for all of the work. These are the best and the brightest, and please go out and use your skills that you learned in this program and make it a better world.